Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altmann, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Peter Galison. Peter Galison is the Pellegrino Professor of the History of Science and of Physics at Harvard University. He teaches courses on a variety of topics, including science and war, the philosophy of technology, the Einsteinian revolution, science and architecture, and recently a class called Filming Science. His books include How Experiments End, Einstein's Clocks, Poincaré's Maps, Empires of Time, and most recently, Objectivity, written with Lorraine Daston. Peter Galison is also a documentary filmmaker. His film on the moral political debates over the H-bomb, entitled Ultimate Weapon, The H-Bomb Dilemma, has been shown frequently on the History Channel and is widely used in courses and seminars in the US and abroad. His latest film, Secrecy, co-directed with Rob Moss, premiered at the 2008 Sundance Film Festival. The film is about the vast, invisible world of government secrecy. Peter was a guest of the Oregon Humanities Center on January 20th and 21st when Secrecy was screened, and he gave a lecture entitled Assassinated Relativity. Peter, welcome.
Welcome. It's great to be here.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to us in the middle of two other presentations on this visit. We're keeping you busy. You have an interesting dual focus that's represented in your two events here on campus. Could we talk first about your life as a filmmaker and how you became a filmmaker from, you started as a historian of science, you did a degree in physics. How did filmmaking happen?
Well, a lot of the work that I do has been involved with the materiality of science, about what really goes on in laboratories, about what the practices are that people use to try to secure knowledge about things like the very small. And partly through that, and I have a long interest in film and photography, I was quite struck about 20 years ago by a film that I saw called The Day After Trinity by a terrific filmmaker named John Else, about the building of the atomic bomb and J. Robert Oppenheimer's role in that. And it occurred to me, since I've been working on a later set of events in nuclear history, which was the development of the hydrogen bomb, which is a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb that exploded over Hiroshima. And I wanted to see if there was a way to use film to try to get at this huge debate that split apart the community of physicists, and put one of them on the side of thinking that if we built this hydrogen bomb, it could lead to the end of the world, I mean, really to the destruction of modern civilization. And on the other, if we didn't build it, that the United States and its allies would lose the Cold War and would have catastrophic political consequences. So I began slowly over the course of the 1980s. This is a period of great, intense expansion of the arms race. And I started interviewing on film certain of the participants, working with a friend and colleague. And I spent a lot of time at Los Alamos and other places. And I wanted to make a film that would be respectful of the argument in some ways, and respectful of the audience, to not sort of force people through to a certain view that one side was absolutely right and the other side were idiots or worse, and that I thought film could be a way of taking what I understood to be interesting about the development of science and technology and opening it up to smart people who are not specialists, not academics, people who want to think about these hard questions about war and peace and the role of technology in it, and but would find it more accessible to see this through a film and to visualize these spaces, the laboratories, the tests, the way that people use the expressions on their faces and the gestures with their hands, to try to get at what this was about. So I made this film, and that took many years. Eventually finished it, and we showed it on the History Channel in 2000, and it's been used in classes. It's called Ultimate Weapon, the H-bomb debate. And so that was the first film that I got involved with, and I really enjoyed it. It was tremendously interesting. It was hard, I mean, to make the transition from print to film. But that was the first substantial project. I made some films in high school and college, but they were not very consequential.
Had you intended that the audience include a lot of secondary school students, for example? that this be used, that this be built into curricula and become a teaching tool?
My first film, it has been used in some secondary schools and in universities and elsewhere. It was shown at Los Alamos, for instance, and the physicists watched it and had a debate about it, which was interesting. But I've learned more about that since. And the more recent film that I made, that we showed here, Secrecy, was actually integrated into a curriculum by an interesting organization at Brown University called Choices for the 21st Century. And they designed a curriculum which you can download from the site of our film, secrecyfilm.com, and it's free. And if you, and then it's possible for teachers to get copies of the DVD and use it in classes. We made a version that's shorter that would fit into a class length, typical class length. So I think that's one of the ways that films get out there. They also get out in normal distributions of DVDs to individuals and with movie theaters and television and film festivals. So it's kind of guerrilla warfare getting an independent film distributed. You have to really try to figure out all the different ways that you can make it accessible. It's pretty interesting, but it's not easy.
You've been very successful in getting Secrecy distributed. It sounds to me, it showed up at a couple of different film festivals, not just Sundance, is that right? And then opened in 30 cities, I believe, in the first round cinemas?
Yeah. So Sundance was a great privilege to have the film in. It's the biggest of the most famous of the film festivals, and it got the film a great launch. And then there's many other film festivals. Many cities all over the States and throughout Europe now, more and more, see film festivals as an interesting venue for public culture and public discussion. And so that was great fun. I mean, some of the festivals are tiny and they're done very informally in rooms wherever they can grab a projector and show the film. And other ones are like Austin. There's South by Southwest, which is another big and terrifically well-structured festival, or San Francisco, or Tribeca in New York. And those places were great for discussion and panels, but some of the small places, Nantucket or Newport or various ones out west, that can be terrifically interesting because they're intimate enough to have a real discussion. And the people that go to film festivals are quite committed. Showing it in theaters is rather different. I mean, it's fun to go to a place where people buy popcorn and actually see your film. But in a way, it's a more demanding audience. I mean, when people plunk down their $10 and go see a film, it's a little bit different than the film aficionados who are there in festivals. So that was interesting too, and you learn a lot about what you've done in festivals. You sit there with an audience and you learn. What do people react to? Where are their questions? What do they see connections to? We wanted the film to create some political discussion. I think that another reason that I've pursued the documentary film is I think that in issues of national importance and that touch on my area of science and technology and their associated political connections, the cinema is the place where we have these national discussions now. Years ago, it might have been the papers of record. People would come in and everybody would have read the Washington Post or the New York Times or the LA Times or Chicago Tribune, and then that was the basis for deliberation about the issues of the day. And then that faded somewhat, and the network television took over, and then network television was sort of displaced by cable, and cable, for a while, there was CNN and certain, established forms for people watched, and then that's distributed over many, it's fragmented into other tinier markets. So it's now complicated, but I think one of the places that we in the United States in these early years of the 21st century are having our collective experience and discussion is around cinema, and that's another reason, aside from questions that things that I'm just fascinated by cinema. I love cinema, but it's also a forum that in some ways addresses this moment in political discussion.
You're in very good company. Certainly Michael Moore's films, for example, have done very well, I think, with a general audience over the last few years. Go ahead.
I think that's right. I mean, there are now quite a number of people. I mean, Errol Morris, for instance, has done a whole series of terrifically influential films, and it's gotten to be. People now go to the cinema to see an independent film, whether it's independent fiction or independent documentary. So I think it's an exciting time.
You chose a great topic with secrecy. That's obviously a very polemical issue and a very timely one.
Mm-hmm.
I can see that it might have evolved out of your interest in history of science and your interest as a physicist. But why did you decide to choose that particular issue?
Well, one reason was I've worked for a long time using archives from Los Alamos and other places. The whole history of nuclear weapons is very tied up with the fate and role of physicists or scientists more generally, in the United States. I mean, it was really the nuclear weapons project that created the very large-scale structure, the big national laboratories. I mean, you wouldn't have had the early post-war development of very large-scale government-funded accelerators, for instance, if there hadn't been these very large-scale laboratories in World War II. So I've been fascinated with that for a long time, and part of that project, nuclear weapons are really the ultimate secret. I mean, that was the paradigmatic and first case of large-scale, bureaucratically enforced secrecy. That's when you had hundreds of thousands of people working in classified situations. Not that it's the first time there were secrets or military secrets. I mean, military secrets go back to ancient Babylonia, I'm sure. But in its modern form, this is the origin. It's World War II, and especially around nuclear weapons and radar. So I thought, working in that world, I began to be interested in how it functioned and how people make decisions about what should be classified, what do they think knowledge is like. In some ways, secrecy is the opposite of science. Science is all about the public, the shared, the disclosing, and secrecy is all about hiding. And so I thought that would be interesting, and if I could understand better how secrecy worked, I would understand better how knowledge flows and how we move. Because to understand how to sequester knowledge, you have to understand something about it. So I found that very interesting, and I just as in the hydrogen bomb case, I wrote about it first, and then I started working on the film, and I've written some about the way the national security secrecy system functions, and then turned towards making this film. So it's quite interesting, taking me places I wouldn't have otherwise gone.
When you did some preliminary remarks before we screened the film here on campus, you mentioned the challenge, first of all, of convincing your co-filmmaker, but also of portraying something that is unspoken and unseen. It must have posed you some specific challenges as a filmmaker to talk about secrecy.
Well, it is an absurd topic for a film, really. I mean, secrecy, what is there to see? I mean, there's nothing to see. And if it's secret, then who's going to talk to you? And if they talk to you, who's going to believe them? So it was a big challenge, and that's partly what interested us. Here's this immense structure, and we spend in the United States about $10 billion a year keeping our national secrets. That's staggering, and yet it's the thing that we don't see at all. So then, there are between 2 and 3 million people who work under conditions of classification. That means that you surely know several of them. So it's a fascinating structure, and we began to think about that, and also enjoyed the idea of how to visualize it. And what made the film possible in certain ways was that we weren't trying to expose this or that secret. It's not about how high this jet fighter can go or how long a ship can travel without being refueled. It's not about the details of classified information. It's about the way the structure works. How do people decide what's secret, and what does it mean to live in a secret world, and what are the consequences for the way you see you and for trust in your family? How does it affect political deliberation if we can't know things about the reasons for going to war, say? How do we make decisions? How does a democracy function on the one side with the demands of national security, and you don't want the instructions to make a nuclear weapon to appear on the web? I certainly don't. And at the same time, with too much secrecy, it can become impossible to have national debates that we need to have. We need to argue out. It's part of being in a democracy, being a political grown-up.
Your film is a documentary, but you do use a pretty substantial bit of animation artwork. There's a very beautiful and impressive score under certain pieces of it. Could you describe a little bit your decision or how you evolved into using those other elements to augment the interviews that are at the core of the film?
Well, there are two aspects of this. One was, from the very beginning, Rob Moss and I, my co-director, we knew we wanted to expand the film out from just discussion and to use all sorts of elements to get at that, to use animation and to use artworks, music. We wanted to integrate sound effects, sound design, and the music in certain ways. And we did some of our, we filmed some close-ups of objects and documents and shredders, and we went out to sites where, for instance, one site where secrets are destroyed. There's actually a Society for the Destruction of Information, you'll be happy to know, and qualified members of the Society for the Destruction of Information know all about the different standards, for instance, how shredded a document has to be and how randomized the pieces have to be, and do you make them into 1-inch strips or 2-inch strips or millimeter strips? Do you burn them, spread them around, compress them, dump them in acid? There are lots of. So we filmed some of the official shredding site, and so we had lots of things to try to expand out from the purely discursive aspect of secrecy. And then the other aspect that was very important to us was that we didn't want to make the film, many films, especially for television, in the documentary mode are scripted. You say, okay, if I was working on secrecy, I'd say, okay, there are 3 kinds of secrecy, and we're going to talk about government secrecy, and we're going to talk about industrial secrecy, we're going to talk about personal secrecy, and the film will divide into 3 parts, and we need somebody to say this and somebody to say that, and we'll hunt around, find the right people, pre-interview them so we know roughly what they're going to say, slot that into the different pieces, then film for a couple of months, and then you spend 10 weeks or so editing it up, and boom, it's done. And you insert the narrator.
It's all right, thanks, that's for me. So you insert the narrator.
So
right
we wanted to do this very differently. We wanted to start with particular elements and then integrate everything into it. So we started with one interview, and each interview was about 4 hours, which we cut down to a couple of minutes, and then integrated the animation and the music and sound design, so everything, so that we had a core. And then we so where does this need to go? And then we'd go out and talk to somebody else or do some other filming, and the film sort of spiraled out from a core. And that meant that we were working with the composer, John Kusiak, with our chief animator, Ruth Lingford, from the very beginning to make this an integrated whole, and yet working in this spiral fashion. So it took about 4.5 years to make the film. It was a long process, and we edited from the first day to the last. I mean, it was all being constantly worked on.
It's a very successful, provocative product.
Thank you.
And I'm tempted to spend our whole 30 minutes on it, but I do want to take some time to talk about the other side of what you're doing here in Eugene, which is to talk about your lecture entitled Assassin of Relativity. And this is on your work on Einstein and Relativity and his friendship with a man we know in a different context. Could you give a brief précis of what the lecture's about?
Sure. This is in my other or related hat is as a historian of science, especially physics, but looked at in a broader context. And this is a project that involves one of Einstein's close friends and a schoolmate of his in university, and then somebody who lived in the same building as him. Their kids played together. They got married, both to women of Slavic origins who were about the same age when they were quite young, and they talked all the time. They had similar teachers.
Let me just insert his name. His name is Friedrich Adler, correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Friedrich Adler was the son of the head of the Austrian Socialist Party, which in Austro-Hungarian Empire was he was a major figure. He was a sort of the loyal opposition and a huge, huge political party. And young Adler also wanted to be a physicist, studied to be a physicist, studied philosophy as well, and was very interested in politics. So they kept up for a long time. They competed for a job at the same time. Young Adler actually at one point wrote to the Board of Education and said, you know, if you have a chance to hire somebody like Einstein, you shouldn't be a fool and hire somebody like me. You should hire him. So he knew in some ways, even though they disagreed about many things, that Einstein was the vastly superior physicist. But Adler wasn't bad, and he taught at some very good places. And during the beginning of World War I, young Adler split with his father. His father supported the war aims of Austria and Germany, and but was a socialist, but a loyal socialist to the regime. And young Adler identified with had an internationalist identification, and in 1916 shot and killed the Prime Minister of Austria. So he was immediately apprehended, and there was a trial. He was eventually sent to death row, and he was going to be hanged. And while he was in prison, he and Einstein corresponded about the nature of relativity. And Einstein, in fact, defended Adler and pleaded all the way up to the emperor to try to spare Adler's life.
Was Adler, in fact, put to death in the end?
No, in the end, he managed to get things postponed long enough and doing hard labor so that the war ended, and so did the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there was no state, and he walked. He spent World War II on West 106th Street in Manhattan, and then went back and lived the rest of his life in Switzerland, died in 1960.
What a curious outcome.
It's amazing. But he and Einstein had this very vigorous discussion about the nature of relativity, and Einstein responded to him with a care and deliberation that he gave practically nobody else. So it offers a kind of record of Einstein's dialogue with a critic that's fascinating, and it throws some light on what they both want, and sort of these two parallel or skewing paths that began at the same point of young men of similar age and similar training and similar everything, and then they split, and one becomes the most famous man of the 20th century, and the other becomes an assassin.
And gains enormous worldwide political notoriety. One of the compelling aspects of this relationship for me is the reciprocity of it. So Adler advocating for Einstein as the superior physicist, Einstein going to bat for Adler, trying to remedy his situation once he's imprisoned. It runs counter to our notion of Einstein as a very isolated genius figure. Is that part of your reason for telling this story?
It is. You know, when Einstein was young, he didn't fit at all our picture of what Einstein is, or our kind of parody picture of Einstein as this unworldly, sort of spectral character, saint-like figure who made these oracular pronouncements about the nature of things. When he was young, he was very much in the world, and he was fighting with his parents and involved, interested in politics and, turbulent relationship with his first wife, and he was very much involved with things. He took out patents. He argued. He was a patent expert in court. He worked as a patent examiner. He was, arguing with people. He was sarcastic and biting in his relationship to his teachers. He had very close friends. He was in the world, and it's that Einstein that I find actually much more interesting than the oracular saint of his later years.
How did his correspondence with Adler affect what we know as his theory of relativity or other principles of physics?
I don't think Adler's criticisms dislodged him very much from any of his core beliefs or changed the path of relativity. By the time they began to correspond, Einstein had finished basically his general theory of relativity. But what Adler did do was to provoke Einstein into articulating things about the theory, and at one point Einstein actually wrote a kind of a play, a kind of exchange, a dialogue with a critic and a relativist. And in many ways, that comes out of those arguments that he'd been having with Adler. It's not the only source of it, but Einstein, in fact, at one point said to Adler, "I'd like to use one of your counterexamples in my dialogue." So Einstein's trying to figure out a way of speaking. His theory was controversial from the get-go, and there were people ferociously opposed to relativity. And this was one of the ways that he tried to respond to it, was by this dialogue that he wrote.
For us at this remove, it's hard to imagine someone being ferociously opposed to the notion of relativity. What was at stake in the notion that would make people so adamantly against it?
Well, there were a lot of reasons.
A brief answer, but
I mean, one of the reasons was that, I mean, even now, it's easy to associate the word relativity with a kind of moral relativism, which Einstein never had any particular use for. But I think people were upset about that. They were upset about the idea that somehow absolute and firm knowledge could be somehow perspectively variant, that the length of this table would be different for a moving observer than a still observer, even in special relativity. It was upsetting to people. People thought, we know what space and time are. These are the beginning of all things. These are the possibilities of thought itself. And the idea that these absolutes of simultaneity, of length, and of time could be dislodged by Einstein's thought just made people furious. There were Kantians who didn't like Kant occupied a place in Central European philosophical and indeed broader education that was unparalleled. So the idea that this contradicted the central figure of Germanic thought was a problem. People didn't like it because, and as anti-Semitism and nationalism grew, Einstein was a Jew, and there were issues after World War I, or in World War I, between Britain and Germany. The British didn't want to even talk to German physicists. So there are all sorts of reasons that go in very many directions why people opposed Einstein. But relativity became a flashpoint.
On that very tantalizing note, I'm going to have to stop you, but I do want to ask, I know you're writing a book of the same title. When do you anticipate the book will be released?
I hope in a year or two I'll be able to finish it. It's a slow process. There's a lot of archives that I'm working through, and I'd like it to be, it actually takes longer to write a short book, and I'd like to write a short book. So I want to distill this into this moment of encounter between Einstein and his friend, the assassin.
We'll look forward to it. We've been speaking with Peter Galison, co-director of the film Secrecy and the Pellegrino Professor of the History of Science and of Physics at Harvard University. Peter, thanks very much for coming to talk to us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And thanks to all of you for watching. See you next time.